You on? Yep, there he is. Huh? Yep. I hope you didn't speed to get here. Norman would take care of it. I'm good. Thank you for making it. All right. Good evening, everybody. Wow. After dinner? All right. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. And welcome to our third installment of Black Lives Matter Beloit. In our first session, we explored the relevance and the power of the new hashtag norm of activism. We saw its ability to raise consciousness more broadly and quickly, definitely in the spread of Black Lives Matter on a national scale. In the second session, we looked specifically at race and the black body and identity. We looked at institutional racism and concluded that we are not a part of a system that is broken. We are living in a system that was conceived long ago and is working exactly as it was intended to do all those many years ago and 400 years later. It is embedded in us. That brings us to tonight. As we try to understand, look at these issues with and through the eyes of the law enforcement and all of you. All lives are supposed to matter, but the question is, do black lives not matter when it comes to protect and serve? I'm really thankful for our panel that we have here tonight, honored with the panel that we have. On my first, we have Nicole Truesdale. Nicole is director of the McNair Scholars Program and an adjunct assistant professor of anthropology at Beloit College. Dr. Truesdale's research interests focused around issues of race and racism, class, national identity, citizenship, belonging, and radical black thought. As director of McNair, she also works with the first-generation college, low-income, and minority students in higher education. She is a founding member of the Black Lives Matter Beloit Committee. Norm Jacobs has served 26 years of progressively responsible positions at the Beloit Police Department in the community. He has worked his way up from the early days when he started in 1978 through the ranks to sergeant, captain, deputy of the police, and now chief of police since 2010 for the Beloit Police Department. He has his MS degree, he has a BS degree in criminal justice from the University of Wisconsin-Platteville and his MS degree in public administration from Cardinal Stritch College. He's a graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Is that right? Quantico. Okay. And has been married 32 years to Nancy and has two sons, David, who is also a police officer, and Michael, who is in civil engineering. And we are thankful to have you here today. Thank you. Our next panelist is Ron Nakora. Ron joined the faculty of Beloit College in 2013 as an assistant professor of political science and health and society. Professor Nakora teaches courses in U.S. federal government and politics, health and global health inequalities, and public health policy. He is a founding member of the Black Lives Matter Beloit Committee. Captain Bisa French from the Richmond, California Police Department. Captain Bisa French was born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area. She joined the Richmond Police Department in 1998, holding many different assignments and working her way up through the ranks. In 2013, she was promoted to the position of captain. She was the first African-American Latina female captain and youngest ever to hold this position. Captain French has extensive experience in field services, criminal investigations, and community policing programs. In addition, Captain French has worked extensively on issues of domestic violence and sexual assault and was on the leadership team that started a family justice center in Contra Costa County. Captain French currently oversees a policing district with additional responsibilities for the Youth Services Division and Traffic Division. Through her position, she is determined to build stronger community, police relationships, and increase police legitimacy through the concepts of procedural justice. Captain French possesses a Bachelor of Science degree in Public Administration from Union Institute and University and is working on a master's degree at Golden Gate University. Aside from work, Captain French is a married mother with 3 children ages 6, 11, and 20, which are all a handful, I understand. Director Charles A. Tubbs, Charlie to some of us. Charlie Tubbs is the Director of Emergency Management in Dane County, Wisconsin, former Chief of Police, Administrator of the Wisconsin State Capitol Police. With nearly 4 decades of knowledge, experience, and service in the fields of law enforcement and homeland security, Director Tubbs is an internationally recognized practitioner and educator on issues involving public safety, emergency management, and preparedness, community-oriented policing, and crisis management and leadership. Director Tubbs has been at the forefront of developing innovative policing strategies and leading organizational change for the past 38 years. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice Administration from Mount Senario College. He is a graduate of the School of Police Staff and Command at Northwestern University, the Senior Police Executive Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, and the Law Enforcement Executive Development Institute of the FBI National Academy. He has also received training from the United States Department of Justice on the subject of hate crimes and diversity. Charlie is a native of Beloit, and we're happy to have him here and glad that he can make it down in light of a lot of things he's been dealing with up in Madison, and so we're really glad for him to be here today and share this opportunity with us.
Oh,
That's good.
beef. Huge beef.
So, even though the data shows that the use of lethal force is not high overall, what is the protocol for engaging an individual in an apparently, seemingly non-lethal situation?
I guess I'll start. Non-lethal encounters with law enforcement starts with command presence. When a police officer arrives at the scene, that's why they wear the uniform. They're supposed to project some type of authority, some type of control. If that doesn't work, then dialogue. It can be soft dialogue, it can be hard dialogue, very loud, obnoxious. If that doesn't work, then you go to empty hand techniques. For instance, if you put your hands on someone, they're under arrest. Pressure points, when you see an officer with their hands around someone's neck, it's supposed to be for pressure points, twisting their arms, their wrists, getting under control. If that doesn't work, then they go to active countermeasures. They're supposed to push away. And they use some of the tools that they're given. A baton is one, although that's rarely used anymore. OC spray or pepper spray is another one. That's the next least used. Then the next thing is the ECD, or what most people consider as a taser. And that's used as an attempt to control a person. That single device in the last 10 years has probably had the most significant effect on law enforcement of any piece of equipment since body armor. It's saved the lives of people, it's saved officers, it's saved injuries of persons who have been arrested and police officers. After that, there's very few other options before it gets to lethal force, and the officer can only use lethal force when their life is threatened. And what we look at on these terrible videos are some terrible examples or good examples of situations where lethal force is not allowed. But there are many cases where it is, and that's probably for another discussion.
Thank you.
So when you look at officer contacts, you first want to look at, is this a consensual contact, meaning that the person hasn't done anything wrong, or is this an enforcement contact? And every police contact is an opportunity to build a relationship, or at least build some kind of common ground. So you want to start off with the approach that you're talking to the person just like you would talk to any person, any family member, and that's the thing. You want to treat people with respect, talk to them with respect, because how you approach the situation is how they're probably going to respond to it. So if you have a approach to it that like the chief said, you want to have a command presence, but there's a way to do that that's respectful. Everybody wants to be treated with respect. So when you talk to somebody, you talk to them with respect, and a lot of times that kind of shows where the contact is going to go. If the person sees that you're trying to respect them and that you have a legal right to be stopping them, or even if they don't believe, just the respect portion of it is going to get you somewhere. So besides the respect aspect of it, if this is an enforcement encounter and it turns to having to use force, you always want your officers to evaluate what kind of encounter is this? Is this something that I know who the person is, I know the person that's involved, do I really want to go hands-on? And there's some cases that you are. There's some cases in which that you're going to need to take the person to jail. But for a minor traffic infraction, that has to be weighed. And it's like, okay, can I take this case to the district attorney's office, get it charged, and issue a warrant for his arrest? Or do I need to take that person into custody immediately? And again, I'm from California, so some of these things might be different here in Wisconsin or in other places, but this is what we're teaching our officers. You need to weigh what kind of enforcement action you're taking and what the infraction or what the violation is. And if it's enough, then we're going to use whatever force necessary to overcome the resistance if we need to. We don't want to use deadly force if they're just trying to fight us unless it warrants it. So we have everybody sees us in our uniforms, and we have a whole array of options to go to, but we always teach our officers the very first thing that you want to use is your mouth, and you want to try to get all the compliance necessary, if you can, by just using different words and trying to get the compliance that way. Like I said, there are times where you're going to have to use force, but you want to use the least amount of force necessary to overcome the resistance.
Thank you.
My approach, the approach I always used was always voluntary compliance was my first approach. I wanted people to understand that they had an option, the option to cooperate, the option to explain. I wanted to know the facts of what's going on from dispatch or wherever I got the information from. I wanted to know the facts, if possible, from the person that I'm encountering. Again, voluntary compliance, as both speakers have already spoken about, the respect, showing respect, hearing respect, approaching them in a manner of that's not threatening, not overcoming, not overbearing. It's gonna seem to be, to me, you're gonna get a better sense of cooperation from the person. I want to point out too that, sorry about that, I got a deep voice or a loud voice. I want to point out, and I really want to say this in a very positive, professional manner, in which I really truly mean. The majority, and I mean the majority of law enforcement officers I work with right here in the city of Beloit and across the country are great people. And they will do and go the extra mile of the way to help people. And I really want us to remember that tonight as we sit here and speak, but that is very important for me to share that with you as a police officer, law enforcement officer, and a person who ran the Department of Corrections for the state for the last 40 years. I've been involved in this. I want to emphasize that. But I also want to emphasize that the majority of the people and citizens we meet on the street are good people. They're very good people who are in tough times and going through difficult situations. And we have to recognize that, and we have to, again, treat them with the utmost respect and try to understand their situation. And as you heard before, we try to meet force with force. And by meeting force with force, you try again as much as possible to communicate, dialogue, talk, do all you can to get voluntary compliance so it does not result in a situation as we saw here in the video. That type of behavior, what I saw in the video, in my eyes, is unacceptable. I have not read the reports. I have not spent any quality time speaking with anyone from that level on this particular situation, but from what I've been able to see and witness and what I know, that's an unacceptable way of behaving as a law enforcement officer.
Thank you. One of the things that we've talked about, and actually Chief Jacobs has shared with us, is one of the things that leads to some of the issues that we're faced is the easy access to weapons. And I'm interested to know, is that truly a factor in some of the issues that we have? Is just this easy access to weaponry, and how did that happen, and what can we do, or how do people combat that?
I believe that's part of the problem with violence. Some people would argue that it isn't, but what we see, particularly in Beloit in the last 12 months, are persons that are acting out anger and they go to a weapon to use. And they haven't thought about murdering someone up till 2 minutes before it happens, even less time. They have access to this weapon and other people that are involved in a fight. It's not planned like it used to be, where someone would have a gun and go after someone. It's just plain violence, and that's what I point at. We have to stop this violence. Stopping weapons is very difficult. We have a program in Beloit where I'm trying to get our officers to get the weapons out of cars, because I know that they're traveling back and forth between each side of town. Some people are shooting them off in the air, and they use cars to transport, and police always fall back on what they do best. We stop cars, we stop people. We try to find these guns to get them off the street before they're used against citizens and other persons in the community. That's why we got an automatic license plate reader to try to identify some vehicles that are going back and forth across town, and use technology for that way. The other way to deal with with weapons is try to stem the flow, but frankly, that's impossible right now. There is no way manufacturers of weapons are going to make them safer. There's no way they're going to stop the flow of them, and there's no way our legislators are going to make it more difficult for people to get weapons. I don't know what it's going to take, but the slow mass murder of African Americans in large urban areas in the United States is going to continue until we change a lot.
I would also say that it's not just one directional in the way in which weapons are being brought into the communities. And so I think another thing we need to think about is the easy access law enforcement has to military-grade weaponry, especially since 9/11. And I think that becomes another problem that we see here. So even if there's weapons on the streets and officers are approaching individuals for minor infractions, what then becomes the line in which we go from just what you guys were describing in terms of subduing and first dialogue, then subduing, to all of a sudden we go away from that and it's military grade trucks, there's military grade weaponry, there's military grade use of armory. That how equipped are local law enforcement how equipped are they to actually be able to utilize these weaponries in a way that is not militaristic and it's still police enforcement? So I think we walk a slippery slope between civil liberties when we start to essentially turn our own people. So I think it's a dual flow. It's the weaponry in the community, but it's also the ways in which weaponry is used by the law enforcement that's too high grade against its own citizens.
I'd like to sort of jump in there. I mean, one of the issues, and I think Chief Jacobs really pointed out, is that there's a legislative problem with the attempt to stem the flow of guns privately across the United States. And of course, that stems primarily from the Second Amendment. Of course, that is not the only thing that's happened, right? There have also been court cases in the late 2000s that have made effectively the possession of handguns something that was effectively decriminalized it to a great extent. We had a couple of cities, Washington, D.C. and Chicago, that had tried to take steps because of their gun violence, particularly handgun related violence, to limit handgun ownership. But again, successive Supreme Court challenges eventually led to those ordinances, those local ordinances being repealed, and yeah, so that's become an issue as well. But I just also want to piggyback on this idea of military-grade weaponry, and of course, what a lot of folks don't know, and we'll talk about, I think, a little bit more about where these weapons come from, is that there's also an incentive built into the program. One of the programs called the 1033 program. There's an incentive built into that program for law enforcement to use any of the military-grade weaponry that they get. In fact, one of the caveats to it is that the material, now, one of the additional caveats is that it's not all weaponry. A lot of it is also like, filing cabinets and that sort of thing as well. But the material that they get has to be used in some respect within a year, or else they have to give it back, right? And that's the sort of grant program that's happening there. So, that's also an issue. But again, these two points together, the sort of ready use of handguns, and I agree with Chief Jacobs here, that there tends to be that access allows people who, once they become angry, it's a quick move from being upset to being upset with a gun to someone losing their lives. And it's clear that there are these two pieces here that are very important to this puzzle.
With regards to military weaponry, we in the city of Richmond realized that, it doesn't look good for the police to roll up in a big Bearcat armor, vehicle. So we decided that we weren't going to write grants to request that kind of military equipment, and we don't accept that military equipment in the city of Richmond. The police should not look like an occupying force. They should not be dressed coming to your neighborhood every day in all black get up with big guns and stuff. That's not what we're here for. There are certain times when we need to use that kind of weaponry and stuff like that, but every day, that's not gonna build relationships. That's the us versus them mentality. We're not an occupying force. Back in the late 1800s, Sir Robert Peel developed the first modern police department in England. This is the late 1800s, and his quote was, "We are, the people are the police and the police are the people." We are all supposed to be involved in policing, not just the police department, everybody, the community also, and that's what we want community policing to look like in Richmond. And community policing is all police officers, not a set of officers that are sent into the neighborhoods to do community policing. It's every officer on our department.
Well, there's one point I should make about the military equipment, and at least in its defense. And I agree that there's a time and a place for everything. But we also can't step back to the 50s when a police officer would defend themselves by standing behind a 3-inch sapling tree when someone in a building had a rifle and was shooting at them. Because I don't think we want to put our officers in harm's way if they don't have to. We have a Bearcat that we purchased with 3 police departments in Rock County, and the reason why we did it is considered the best platform for inserting special operations people into a scene where there's weapons. It seems to make sense. Instead of officers driving up in a tin can car in front of a house where there's someone inside shooting out, that they roll up in the best vehicle possible to get them there safely, or if someone is hurt out inside. So I got to say that it's good for one point, but there's also times not to use it, and that's where you really have to be careful when you go back to your communities, and if your police departments have these weapons and tools, they should have policies on them, they should train with them, and they should only use them. They should be able to tell you under what circumstances they would use that equipment if you want to make a difference where you live.
I'd just like to add a comment to that. I feel strongly that those types of military vehicles should be used for mainly recovery situations, and that's recovering someone who might be, it might be a armed intruder in a home, and we need to drive up, and we need to attempt to get them out safely. That's my #1 focus of these vehicles, is to have them available for recovery purposes, not to stand on the streets and appear that it's us against them. I can tell you, when I was the chief of police of the state capitol here in Wisconsin, and we, in 2011, averaged about 10 to 12,000 people inside the Capitol and another 35 to 50,000 people outside, I would not allow, unless it was absolutely necessary, anyone to even wear riot gear at that particular situation. I felt we'd be more effective by wearing regular uniforms of the day and addressing the crowd in a professional manner and allowing government to continue to work, do their job, at the same time allowing the citizens to exercise their constitutional rights and have a balance. But by showing up, I felt, in riot gear, pepper spray, shells, it would only make the situation much worse, and we had not reached that situation. So I'll say this, and this is a criticism of my profession. Sometimes we react too quick in that situation, and sometimes our reactions can create a very dangerous situation.
All right, so kind of heard a lot, so I kind of want to hear from the audience a little bit. Any questions or thoughts over what you've heard thus far? Questions you might have that have come up? Any thoughts you might have? Yes. You're in control of it.
Hi there. So I was wondering if you could comment on the increased use of SWAT-style warrant enforcement for raids on personal homes in nonviolent situations. I know there's been a lot of criticism about that, and particularly who this is used against, high numbers against Hispanic and blacks, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, there is an inappropriate use of SWAT teams around the country for unnecessarily for low-risk warrants, and I think that's because once you have a team, they're trained, they're ready to go, you have to use them. That's because that police department probably doesn't have a policy, they don't use a matrix to identify when that team should be used. We have a matrix where we use our team for those types of warrants, but we have to have some type of threat to the officers that's greater than just maybe just a handgun in the house. So That's my example. If you have a tool, sometimes it doesn't matter what you have, people want to use it. And SWAT teams are a tool.
We don't use SWAT teams for low-level arrest. And just to put things in perspective for people that don't know where Richmond is, or anything about Richmond, which most of you guys probably don't, historically, Richmond has been one of the most violent cities in the nation, next to Camden, New Jersey, and Compton, California. So as we have this conversation, I just want to put that in perspective.
And believe it or not, at the Wisconsin State Capitol Police, we did not have a SWAT team. We utilized, if we needed one, the Madison Police Department or the Dane County Sheriff Department. But we did not have a SWAT team on the ground.
I'll just sort of chime in with what has become one of my, I'm going to put in air quotes, one of my favorite stories. Those who were in my American government class last year, you remember, or last semester rather, you remember this incident that happened in Marathon, Wisconsin, right? The MRV, the Marathon County Response Vehicle, was used, again, it's one of these armored personnel carriers, was used to effectively extract a judgment, a civil judgment, on a 75-year-old man. He had refused to come out of his house. Again, did not brandish any weapons or anything like that, but he simply refused to come out of his house. And I've got the quote here that I just love. It's from the sheriff that was there. He said, "I've been in about 5 standoff situations where as soon as the MRV shows up, the person gives up." And it goes on to talk about how, ultimately it saves time and it saves money. And it wasn't just the MRV, right? The MARV rather, sorry. But also 24 officers showed up as well. And whenever this story was brought to me by a student, and every time I think about it, I think to myself, was there no other way to extract a judgment from this man? Could you not wait him out? Could you not, refuse to allow him to buy anything in town? I mean, there seems to me that there's so many different ways that this situation could have been dealt with. And to use this sort of material, this sort of equipment in the expedient way in which it was utilized, to me smacks of like a fundamental disrespect of people's lives and their personhood. And that's the problem that I have with that. So again, that's my comment. And it's a favorite story, but not really such a good story.
This question is actually for Captain French, and I wanted to know more about what turned Richmond Police Department around for people who don't know, right? Because it did have one of the highest homicide rates for quite a while in the, 80s, 90s, until...
Early 2000s.
Yeah, early 2000s, until the arrival of, Chris Magnus as chief of police. And so, but you had been there before, right? So I just wanted to kind of get a sense of what was that culture change that happened, and what kind of buy-in was there from the community and the police officers who had already been on the force with these new kinds of techniques of policing?
I'll try to be mindful of time because this is over a 9-year change that we've gone to one of the most violent cities in the nation to only having 14 homicides last year, which is the all-time low for our city ever. But when the chief came, he was committed to making a change, and that change started with how we did policing. He broke the city up into 3 different policing districts, and he made it the priority that each officer was going to stay in their district and on their beat for longer periods of time so they could get to know the community, get to know the people in their beat, good and bad, and develop relationships. So before, the community didn't like us. We had an adversarial relationship with the community, and that's because of the violence that was going on. We were basically, there to enforce. We were doing enforcement work, and that was it. We weren't trying to do any preventative work because we had so many homicides and shootings and violent crime happening. But even though those things continued, his focus was no, you need to develop relationships. Relationships are everything. So the officers have to work in their beat area for at least a year, and we try to keep them there for longer term. So if they don't go into a special assignment, they stay there for the next year, and that develops relationships. They get to know who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, so that when we're going into a neighborhood, historically, policing in general, we hotspot patrolled. If there was a lot of violence in a certain neighborhood, we would focus our attention, put a lot of resources, a lot of cops in that area, and stop everybody that was coming and going. Well, that wasn't a good tactic because there's a small group of people that are committing crimes, not the entire neighborhood. The neighborhood is a victim to these crimes. So we stopped doing hotspot policing and focused on the people that were actually doing the crimes, because everybody knows who's doing the shootings and who's the bad guys in the neighborhood. So we don't have to target the entire neighborhood. And when we stopped doing that, people started to trust us a little bit more. When they started seeing their same police officer day after day in their neighborhood, and they got to know their names, they got to start coming to meetings and seeing who that officer was, they developed a relationship, a little bit of trust. And when crimes did happen, they'd whisper, hey, so-and-so over there might have done it. You know, it was all about that community building relationships, and it took a while because we have people that would not snitch. I mean, that's a big thing, no snitching. But when you have a relationship with the officer, you don't quite see them just as that cop. You see them as, hey, this is kind of like a friend. Not really a friend, but I know this person, so I'm more willing to give up some information. And we use that to our advantage. And so now when we have something happen, we might get some phone calls as to who might be involved, even if it's not direct, you know, telling who it is. We have some relationships where we, you know, and the community also saw that there was a change, so they started to call more, hey, can you guys come out here because this is going on, I don't want a shooting to happen. So we started having more calls for service in certain neighborhoods because they began to trust that we were going to come out there and take care of the problem. So it's all about relationships and community trust and building that trust. And that means that officers have to stay in the area for a longer period of time to build that trust. That's a majority of it.
Siri.
Latinos weren't really addressed by anyone in the panel, so I was just wondering, what is it with training, or just like, is it stereotypical that those communities get targeted a lot more in policing, and those are the ones that you would call hot spots?
Police generally, if they're not trained in another way, look for what's called low-hanging fruit, the easiest thing to deal with, and street crime is the easiest thing to deal with. Most of the street crime is in poor neighborhoods, in urban communities, and those communities have high concentrations of Latinos and persons of color, and they tend to get swept up with the general enforcement, and that tends to cause a lot of problems. So you have to be aware of that. And you have to force your officers to look at the people rather than the areas for the crime. Now, you mentioned something about training, and that's very important to remember because most police officers will fall back on their training no matter what they do, whether it's good or bad. The incidents that you see where officers are using deadly force, they're usually trained in some manner that way. And as far as training goes, training is not the same all across the country. So when we talk about one incident here, that doesn't necessarily reflect on all police departments. There's 780,000 law enforcement officers in the United States, 18,000 agencies, and there really isn't one way that they all train the same. Many of them train to certain standards that are set by agency like CALEA, or there's state agencies that set accreditation standards and they try to meet those, or certain states have minimum standards for their law enforcement officers to maintain, but that's by each state. So they will do what they're trained to do, and some agencies, particularly in very poor states, receive very little training, and that's where we see a lot of the terrible incidents.
We recognize that there's a disproportionate number of minorities being stopped, even in Richmond, and where we've had a lot of changes. So what we've started to do is focus on implicit bias training for our officers. So we're trying to do more culturally specific training for our officers to get them to recognize we all have biases, but how not to act on making sure that your actions don't reflect your bias and it reflects the situation that you're seeing before you. So that is a challenge for us, but we're trying to address it.
Hi, hello, good evening. I was just wondering what I would like to hear a response on the presence or like existence of quotas for the prison industrial complex at large, and how communities are supposed to, yeah, we can police ourselves, yeah, we can police the police, I guess. Apparently not, but how is change really supposed to happen when there are these massive quotas that 1%ers who aren't being policed whatsoever are profiting off of basically modern slavery in our prisons and jails? I would just want to hear a response to how we're supposed to really overcome this extreme militarization when there are these standards of X amount of beds have to be filled every year. And oftentimes, even prison blueprints are made up from such a young age of the standardized tests of third graders. That is how blueprints are envisioned for prisons based on those failures. So how much is this system really setting people up to be imprisoned for basically life? I mean, disenfranchisement, like, it's ruining communities. It's not a solution.
I don't want to take over, but I could respond. We don't have quotas where I'm from. We don't use quotas. But the thing is, now is the time to really change the systems. I mean, the system that we had may have worked or may have not for years, but now with the national conversation, this is the time to make change. And historically, police officers have been focused on data. How many citations can you write? That's how we measured how effective we were as police officers. Now we're moving to procedural justice, meaning how does the community feel about the police? And that's what really matters. How do you guys feel about how we do our job? And that's what we need to focus on, procedural justice.
Again, I've never worked in an agency where I worked under quotas either. We've had performance standards. If you didn't meet them, you may be counseled on them, but I've never worked in an agency of quotas. I can tell you the prison system here in Wisconsin now is $1 billion operation. It's large. When I ran the Department of Corrections for juveniles from the ages of 13 to 25, we made some significant changes on people being incarcerated in the juvenile justice system and being sent to the adult prisons. I can tell you there's changes that are taking place right now. I can't give you all of them, but I can tell you there's some positive changes being made, but maybe not quick enough, not soon enough. And then again, in policing communities, my experience, there's areas of the community where police are called quite often by the citizens who live in that community, and they are expecting a response from you to come out. And as the chief said from California, you said chief?
Captain.
I'm sorry, captain. You speak like a chief. In doing so, those calls that are coming in from the community at a rapid pace, it's very important that you meet with the community, dialogue with the community, because I talked about it back in 1987 right here in Beloit, Wisconsin, when we were getting calls about people standing on corners bouncing basketballs. I told them at that time we are starting a terrible trend the clock is ticking on these arrests. They start off as disorderly conduct arrests. Next thing you know, you got several of them. It becomes an enhancer crime or habituary criminal. And now you've handed the judge a court case with some young person with maybe 5 or 6, 8 or 9 or 10 disorderly conducts, and they're faced with the situation of sending them away to jail for a long period of time or prison. So we must communicate this information and educate the public on how we are going to police, how they want the community policed, and look at alternatives to arrest. Alternatives to arrest. It cannot be zero tolerance anymore. It cannot be mandatory arrest. We have to come up with alternatives. The prison system is gaining more financial support than our schools, and that's a shame. When I left the prison system in 2008, it was costing at that time, I believe, roughly $100,000 a year to incarcerate one juvenile. And you'd think what you could do with $100,000 for programs and education, et cetera, for people, period. So we have to get into the communities, educate, talk about how we're going to police that community, and we need the citizens to step forward and take a responsibility on how we are going to police those communities.
There have been several things that have been brought up, and the title of this session was Policing in Post-9/11 America to begin with. And I'm going to pose this to the audience first, but thinking about some of the things that have been said up here in regards to inherent bias into kind of the profiling and those situations, is there a difference? Are we making a presumption, or is there a difference in policing in post-9/11 America, or has it just escalated, especially from the standpoint of how we look at individuals of color, how individuals of color are being dealt with?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in on that.
Was the audience turn first?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, audience. I'm just chomping at the bit.
Hold on.
Mine's a totally different question. Oh, is this on? Is it okay if I ask another question and not respond to that one, Cecil?
Oh, it's Beloit. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just curious if people could talk about like your own, within your realm of law enforcement, and sort of how your officers or the people in your offices are responding to like the national conversation like you talked about, and sort of what they see their role is in this larger national conversation, and what else? Like how they're feeling about it, what they view their job is, sort of, and how they see their impact on this like larger conversation that's playing out, and how we here in Beloit or in Richmond, like how we can make change on a national level.
Well, our officers are affected by what happens on a national level. They've told me so. As a matter of fact, the last officer that retired mentioned that he was just tired of listening to all the concern because reputation of police tends to be the last bad news article that you read or report that you see. Yet there's so many different police officers and police departments around the country. Now, there is some conversations on how to make change. One of the groups that's doing that is the Police Executive Research Forum. They're talking about ways that police officers need to learn to de-escalate violent situations. Police officers are trained to run towards violence. They're taught not to give up ground, to get somebody. Well, what if we talked about, is it okay for a police officer to run away? It may be sometimes, but that's changing the whole culture of policing. That's a huge conversation that has to happen within the organization. And the way we do that is get these think tanks together and speak with command staff level persons, and it trickles down. That filters into some of our accreditation agencies that so few police departments are involved with. They start to set standards, and then the bar gets raised, and it happens very slowly. But our officers pick up on that stuff. They pick up, they watch the news just like everyone else does. They listen to things that other officers say. So they're aware of it. They're aware of the pressure on law enforcement as a group. They don't necessarily like it, but individually they're trying to respond.
I just want to add to that as well. In Dane County, and again, I'm no longer a sworn law enforcement officer, but I'm very close and very involved in the law enforcement culture and emergency services there. The officers in Dane County are hurting right now with the national trend. There's a tremendous amount of pain going on. We're looking out and trying to do things and provide more training. We're trying to be more understanding and look at if we even need officers who need the opportunity to spend more time talking to professionals. The officers are hurting and suffering from some of these actions that have happened right in the city of Madison and throughout the country. So I want to really point that out. They're not turning a blind eye or closed shoulder, but what we're doing in the Madison and Dane County, the leaders of color, and I'm a part of the group, we're meeting with law enforcement administrators every Friday, but it's usually 3 times a week, talking about the issues, not only locally and nationally, and how we can improve the overall quality of life and conditions of everyone in the community. We all recognize and we respect the fact Black Lives Matter, but we have really come up with the professionalism, all lives matter. And we've standing very strong as a team, discussing these issues and providing leadership and guidance and trying to deal with the situations that are at hand at this time.
And in Richmond, I'm going to be honest and frank with you, we're getting pushback from the officers. Some officers we have get it, and that's what we're trying to hire for. We need to change our hiring practices so we can really identify the officers who really want community engagement, and that means probably changing the way we hire people, because obviously we've gotten it wrong in some instances. So we're focused on our hiring practices, but even the reason why my city was asked to come here to Beloit was because my chief, right after the Michael Gardner case was announced, we had a protest. One of our community-based organizations for young people held a protest, and the chief said, we're going to be out there with them. And so the chief, myself, and the other captains went out there, and we protested with the people that were protesting, and he held up a sign that said Black Lives Matter. And boy, did people get mad across the nation. We had hate mail from other police departments, other police chiefs, but then there were police chiefs and other people from police departments sending in letters of support. We support what you did. It was a bold stance, but he held the sign up, and you could go, Google it right now, and you'll see my chief, which is a white male, holding up a sign that says Black Lives Matter. And then we got the officers putting up the Blue Lives Matter signs in their cubicles, and it's like, okay, that's fine. Blue lives do matter, but we're focused on the black ones right now because those are the ones that are dying. And so we had to have a lot of conversation about that. So we do have pushback. To answer your question, we do have some pushback from some officers because they do, quite frankly, feel like they're being attacked because not all of them are bad. Like we started off, there's a majority of officers that join this profession to do the right thing, to help people, to get them the help that they need to respond to calls. And unfortunately, there's a small segment that, does the wrong thing and ends up in the national spotlight.
And I want to kind of go off of what Captain French is saying, because I think what we're seeing is this kind of pushback, individual versus institution, right? And so, yes, there are good individual cops or good individual black people, but the problem is all of a sudden it's not an individual black person, it's all black folks, right? So the minute a police officer, if there's training that, if they're not understanding implicit bias, as you guys are talking about, that's a key thing. You have to understand that as much as we like to group all cops together, it seems it's also as if communities of color are all grouped together. And that's the inherent, I think, problem we're seeing in society right now, is that individuals might be good or bad, quote unquote, but But when we start doing this homogenization of institutions, we start seeing the muck of things, and that's what our second panel talked about, is how this institutional racism embeds itself in every aspect of how we see ourselves as people. So blue lives do matter, but then where is this antagonism between blue and black lives? Because all of a sudden we're seen as these groups versus individuals. So I think we need to understand this kind of dual dichotomy of individual and group, because once we start seeing, well, these are good cops, yes, it's a good cop, but if the institution in which they're trained in is not understood to see the individualization of minorities in this country, then that good cop is still going with and understanding the group as bad. So I think that's the kind we have to really kind of deconstruct there.
And what happens to those of us that fall in both categories?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where, I mean, it's very tough, because I see when people are out there, my husband works for the Oakland Police Department, who I've seen really a ton of protest. I mean, cancel Christmas, cancel Thanksgiving, cancel everything, because there's protests going on every day. And he's out there, he runs programs designed for young African American males to get them to succeed, yet he's out there getting bottles thrown at him because they're protesting the institution, but yet he understands that. So it makes some of us in law enforcement feel like, okay, we're straddling the line because we get both sides of it.
Cecil, I just want to mention too, your question in reference to the change in law enforcement post 9/11. I had the humbling experience to be in the Washington, D.C. area during 9/11, and it was one of the most difficult times of my life, I can tell you that. And I can honestly tell you, and I think everyone at the table here, and I think you all realize, it has changed America. It's changed policing strategies. We're faced with more dangerous situations. We're faced with potential problems that we were never faced with before. For instance, the gym bag sitting right here in front of me. I've been watching that since we've been here because of the training we have. You just don't know what's in that bag, even though it probably belongs to someone, I hope. But it changes the way police departments and police agencies have to train and prepare themselves to protect the nation. And I can tell you right now, that day, as we all know, did change America. And in some ways for the better, and some ways, I have to say, and I have to remind law enforcement and citizens, everyone who's out there is not bad people. There's bad people or people who don't do things very well. But I still believe, in my heart, 95% of the country, the world, the people around are good. It's that percentage that are very dangerous and very bad that makes it very difficult on the rest of us. It makes it very difficult in policing communities and policing the country.
Good.
Yeah, okay, so,
Sorry.
no. No, so, I mean, there has, in response again to this question of what's happened post 9/11, one of the things that certainly happened has been an increase in at least claims of the excessive use of force by police, right? Even as far back as 2007, there was a USA Today article that was published on this, and they were using data and sort of interviews from the Department of Justice, and what they found was in the 2001 to 2007 period, they had seen something like a 25% increase in cases involving excessive use of force by police or other law enforcement. That includes like prison guards as well, right? And other folks, in ways that were deemed to have violated or potentially have violated some civilians' civil rights. And so that's definitely a thing that occurred. What's, for me, even more interesting is that the FBI, even at that point in time, I think around 2002, sort of knew that something was probably going to happen in terms of an increase in police brutality. And why do I say that? Because it was said at the time that they expected the people who entered law enforcement to be both, first of all, a fewer number, and they expected, and this is not me, this is what they were saying, their expectation is that we were going to get people who are of lower quality. And why is that? Why is that? Because so many of the people who would have become police officers, who would have become sort of better police officers, what did they do? Anyone? Yeah. They joined the military, right? They wanted to go and fight terrorism, right? And so there was already the sort of preparation underway that, oh, we may have to anticipate some of these cases, an increase in these cases. So there has been an increase. The DOJ that same year, 2007, reported that they actually had increased their conviction rate in these cases by about 53%. So clearly something had happened, right? But again, as already been pointed out, it really was triggered by this earth-changing event. Funny enough, I was also in the DC area around that time when the planes hit the Pentagon. And then, of course, when they subsequently hit the Twin Towers. And certainly, things did change. Things changed for me. I was meant to be on a plane not even like a week later. And you can imagine the sort of raw terror that I had in thinking that, okay, now I've got to get on a plane. Is it over? We don't know if it's over yet. Over the next few weeks, of course, we saw the shoe bomb and the underwear bomb and all these different things, right? And so clearly law enforcement has had to respond to that. We've also seen, of course, a response to that among the citizenry. We got the Patriot Act, right? And the Patriot Act has done an extraordinary job of curtailing many of our civil liberties that we thought we enjoyed, or at least that certain segments of the population definitely thought it enjoyed prior to 9/11. So it has been a transformative event in American history and American politics for certain.
My question is really for Chief Jacobs. It's about Darius Lowry Baptiste, who was shot and killed by the Beloit Police Department a couple years ago, not even a mile away from where we're standing right here. My question is whether you believe that killing was justified, or why didn't the officers use the other 3 tools in their arsenal before they shot him, like you said? And are your officers trained to use these tools first, or are they trained to just react and shoot to kill? Or why didn't they shoot out his tires, or something else instead of just shooting to kill him?
Okay, that was a tragic situation all the way around. The victims are Mr. Baptiste's family and the officers involved with that shooting. One of the officers, as a matter of fact, isn't a police officer anymore because of that. So when these tragic incidents happen, it's a circle. It's not a line. It's not us against them. It's more of a circle with a lot of different things. In that case, it certainly, the outcome isn't what our community wanted. It isn't what the police department wanted. The district attorney said that the shooting was justified. And it was justified for a number of reasons. You've seen the video, and I've heard the concern that why didn't, I think at the last session here, why didn't the officers jump out of the way? And that's a great question. The district attorney looked at all of the factors involved in that incident. It was the officer's position, the state of mind of Mr. Baptiste before the incident, during the incident, and at the very moment that the officers pulled the triggers on the guns that they had, and also what he considered that isn't mentioned is the safety to the community. When persons are in vehicles trying to get away, it's a danger to the citizens that were unfortunately walking all around our community. It was almost at 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon that day. And so that's why that was justified. It was tragic, it was terrible. I wouldn't want it ever to happen again. If there was another way to do it, certainly we would do our best to do something different.
I would like all of you to respond to, first of all, the practices or training in place that can prevent excessive use of force, that can prevent racially biased policing, and number 2, what you wish were to be in place to prevent those things. And I'd like Chief Jacobs to start.
Well, I would like a discussion on police use of force, police brutality to be a circle instead of a line, because any type of force there's almost like a discussion. Or communication back and forth. It's not just up to the police to escalate or de-escalate a situation. We have to do a better job in training our officers how to de-escalate. Maybe we have to give them more tools, maybe we have to look to the professionals to tell us to take away some tools, but there's also discussion that needs to be occurring in the community, and that would be one of the things I would ask us all to consider, and just consider these things violence. How do we reduce any kind of violence? How are we part of the violence around us? A police officer can go into any situation and escalate the violence. That's one of the things we train them. Is look, don't go in there and make it worse. It's like a doctor. Don't make it worse, okay? But they can. If you have a police officer, a bad police officer, he can aggravate people into an arrest or even worse. But the citizens we deal with also have some type of responsibility as citizens, and most of the times the worst ones we deal with are in states of intoxication, or they have drugs on board that don't let them answer, they don't react correctly, or they're suffering some mental crisis, of which we're learning more now about, and that adds, unfortunately, to a few of the terrible cases that we see. So I think there just needs to be more training on our part and a dialogue on what all of us can do to reduce violence.
So we are looking at a lot of training. We just trained our entire department on implicit bias, and we will continue those training sessions. We're looking at mental health training, crisis intervention training, because that's huge. We have a large population, unfortunately, nationwide, that is not being dealt with because of the cuts in the mental health system. So that's a huge thing, is to dealing with mentally ill people in a way that they can respond, that we don't have to use force. Things that we are looking into doing and actually plan to do later this year is really a focus on the youth, because youth are gonna grow up and become adults, and we have to reach them at an age where they're still willing to listen and engage. So we're doing some training with youth in our high schools to, and what we're doing is we're trying to bring those officers in that are having a more difficult time communicating with the public, and we're using games. I mean, we're starting from the basics, using games that get people to open up and talk and have that dialogue. We had one of these sessions on this past Monday, which was really well. We had about 30 students from a local high school, and we just started off playing different games and asking questions, and asking questions like, well, we didn't have officers in uniform, just starting off asking questions like, okay, if you've had a negative experience, if all of your experiences with the police have been negative, stand over here. And if all your experiences with the police have been positive, stand over here. And this question was posed to the officers and students. And so there's a line that you could stand on that's across the board, and where people stood, then the moderators asked questions. So they saw that some of the officers were more on the negative police side, where they've had negative contacts, because we had a lot of African American officers there. And it made the young folks realize, oh, it's not just us, you guys, because we have to take the uniform off. We don't wear the uniform all the time, but that opened up dialogue as to, okay, what happened and what can we do? And we still have some of the same experiences that the public does, and we have to find a way to make it work. But it's really reaching the youth, and we're really focusing on our training on reaching the youth.
Those are great responses, and I'm just gonna add, hiring the right people. We gotta do a great job of making sure we're getting the right people at the beginning, training them correctly. I think we gotta put as much emphasis on interpersonal relationships, community policing, communications, almost as we do tactical response. There's more tactical response training, I feel, in training than there is the ability to communicate. And we all know, once the lines of communications are broken, we're in trouble. I think great leadership in the organization must be a standout. Great supervision, who's going to hold everyone accountable in that organization. I think working closely with the schools, other than looking at third grade scores to see who's gonna show up and enter the roles of the institutions, we gotta work closer with the school to help produce a better youth to become a productive adult. I feel very strongly about that. The mental health piece, we've heard about it. That's a critical piece. I believe last year when we looked at the prison system, and when I was still there, I believe about 78% of the people in prison were suffering from mental health issues. Better treatment when they have been picked up. And then I just want to add, I don't know if you're aware of this, we have to do a better job with incarceration in this country. If we're going to incarcerate, we have to prepare our citizens who are incarcerated. And yes, I'm calling them citizens. They're inmates, or you can call them prisoners, whatever you want to, but 97% of them are going to return back to our communities. And the better we perform by allowing them to get educated, feel like they have a place in life and a place to return in life, the safer this country is going to be. So those are some things I really think we have to look very closely at in providing a better place organization.
So, Chief Jacobs, you have, I heard you speak to training and that there are different, I understand that there are different training techniques throughout the country. Can you speak to the fact as to why over the past years excessive force has been increased against African Americans, but then you have individuals who go into movie theaters or into schools, they shoot up these places, and yet they're apprehended?
I can only speak to violence that happens in our community and in our situations. I don't see an increase of violence against African Americans in our community by the police. I'm constantly amazed by the low amount of violence that we have with police, with people in our community. We make 6,700 arrests a year, and I get less than 24 complaints. 13 use of force complaints over that, and we use ECDs and pepper spray, and we point our guns. And unfortunately, we've used them in the last year and a half. And I'm amazed about how little problem that we have. So it's difficult to speak about whether whether the problem is magnified by the media now. I think it's important. I'm glad that it is. It's an important issue to get out, and we need to deal with it because it affects so much more in our communities. So I can only speak to the issues that I have here in Beloit.
I don't think the media is magnified. I do want to push back a little bit on that. I think what the media has, because even with the media's portrayal of, you know, the shooting of unarmed black people in this country, usually the first order of business with the media is to let you know exactly whoever was killed, what they did wrong when they were 3 years old, what their parents did wrong, what their granddaddy did wrong. You know, they walked down the street the wrong way one day, and all of a sudden the media, I think, is perpetuating this idea, right, going back to implicit bias, which I think is really important in the Richmond, California training, is that the media is perpetuating this idea that if you are somehow had an infraction when you were young, or even if what you were doing at that time was somehow seen as not going toward the norm, that gives the officer the excuse to then go ahead and use excessive force when it's not needed. And I think it's not just guns, it's a taser use too. You're shooting somebody, tasering them over and over and over again, as we've seen. We saw with Natasha McKinney, who's mentally ill, 130-pound woman who was hand shackled and then tasered over and over again until she died by 4 officers. I think there's a discrepancy there going on. So I think what the media is doing, it's highlighting what's going on, but it's not highlighting the actual issue of excessive force. It's highlighting the fact that we can make this kind of case of, because of what you've done in your past, no matter how small it is, we can then justify this overall idea of who you are as a criminal. I don't know. I think there's a kind of a dual thing going on there.
I want to speak on that too. I want to just quickly say, the situation that happened in Madison on March 6th, and speaking what you said, Chief Mike Koval, the Chief of Police of Madison Police Department, refused to criticize or blame the young man who lost his life there. If you watch that press release of his, that young man had been charged with armed robbery and a number of other cases. The chief took the high road on that one and talked about the loss of that to that family, the loss to the community, and how tragic that was to the community of Madison, to the entire state. That's what I'm talking about, leadership. That's real leadership. He left that negative part out of blaming that young man. He talked about the loss of life. I just want to point that out. That's leadership I'm talking about.
I think you're really sort of tapping into that national level conversation. And it's fair enough that on the local level that you can't respond to that. But there's this national level discourse where we look out and we see this consistent pattern. And again, is it because of a particular type of media portrayal or not? And that's up for debate, but there seems to be this repeated pattern in which certain individuals, even those who have shown themselves to be violent, have shown themselves to have actually taken people's lives, somehow manage to not be shot while they're fleeing, right? And I guess that's sort of where you're at, right? And again, I think that this is I'm not saying that that's happening in Beloit. In fact, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is to ensure that it doesn't happen here, right? Or that it does not happen or continue to happen or happen at a different level or at the same sort of level, preferably not at all. But the issue is, that's what ties, I think, so many of us who have had experiences with the police in our respective communities. Beloit is not the only place I've ever lived. Obviously, I've lived in a number of states. And so that's that national level conversation that I think we can't get away from. We can't leave on the table and say, okay, well, it doesn't happen here. What I think we want, and at least what I would say for myself, what I want is the sort of continued reassurance that that is a conversation that's over there. And that not only are we going to do something here locally to ensure that that doesn't happen, that we're also going to show some solidarity, both in terms of our people here, our citizens here, but also our law enforcement with this larger conversation. And have our law enforcement also ask, wait, why did those folks in Colorado, why were they able to apprehend this person, but they weren't able to apprehend this other person who was not as violent? So, I mean, I see what you're saying, and I think that that is part of obviously part of an ongoing conversation that we need to have here in our town. And I don't know, it's a conversation around solidarity too.
Hi. So I just kind of want to get back to the idea of kind of hiring the right people. But I was just wondering, like, what about the people that have already been like hired and are in the system now? Like, what is in place to make sure that their judgment is being checked and that they are following like all the procedures? Like, as you said, like what is being done about the people who just don't get it?
So in our city, we just implemented the use of body-worn cameras. Every month we review every use of force, and now we'll be reviewing the tapes that go along with them. But it's everyday contacts, and every contact with a citizen is an opportunity, and so we're having our supervisors follow up contact with citizens to see how their contact was. So we're doing some spot checking. So that we realize, I mean, there's people that probably shouldn't be on our department that still are, but we still have to go through the proper channels to get them out. And so we're doing everything that we can to make sure that they know that they're under a watchful eye.
We have a 15-week training program that starts with a number of different tests that include psychological tests, where I get recommendations from our psychologist on whether the person has a fit for our police department and whether they think that they'll be able to follow rules and be a good police officer. A polygraph test, fitness tests, written tests, assessment center tests, interviews, just to get the job. And as a matter of fact, we're going to be hiring, and if you want to make a difference, really make a difference personally, I recommend that you apply to be a police officer here or in the community that you're at to make that difference. And once they're in the job, most police departments have something called an early warning system where they identify officers whose names come up. Maybe they take too much sick time, maybe they have too many citizens' complaints, and then you investigate that officer and see if there's training needed, discipline, or whatever. So that's how we handle it here.
That question makes me think of law and order, right? Because the two are tied. And so even if we talk about the changing of police tactics, police hire, who we hire or who we have now and how do we retrain them, it's also the law side, right? So even if you have the police who are retrained, you bringing in, you're trained doing all that, if when you get to the actual judicial system and you get to that courtroom, right, does a DA actually prosecute if an officer is involved in a lethal force shooting? And we're seeing in this country right now, they're not prosecuting. So even if we do train our officers to see us as individuals, not just black people or brown people, if we do talk about implicit bias, and if we do talk about more dialogue and community engagement, what does it mean then if we go to the law side, the law side of law and order, when they refuse to actually then themselves change that system so that we actually get the things that we actually are seeking as communities, which is justice, which is the indictments, which is we don't have to, if we have the body cams and we're seeing someone get chokehold illegally, that the officers is still not prosecuted. When we see the video of somebody, and it's really emotional when we see somebody getting shot in the back as they're running away, that they're trying to think about, is that murder or not? Do we even think about even trying to indict? So I think it's a dual nature, so that law and order really go hand in hand, so we can change the order, but we gotta get to the law as well.
We're coming near the end of time, so with that in mind, how, in thinking about this, the training, and how do you make those things happen? How do we start coordinating an effort to curtail what we're seeing is an escalation of black bodies piling up for a number of reasons, but what do we have to do?
I mean, I'll take this. This answer may be a little bit subversive in certain ways, but I think the information that came out of Ferguson and the report on what was happening there is instructive. One of the things that, as a person who is both an instructor in American politics and who grew up in Central Virginia where we had America sort of infused into us, right? Virginia was the United States for so long in America's history. And so when it comes to issues of the Constitution, these things are more than passingly important to me. And so one of the things that I think about is how do we create a conversation about how people's rights are being violated, which of their rights are being violated? How are we getting around that? How are we getting around that conversation? Why aren't we expanding that conversation and talking more about what this means, what these sorts of killings mean for the civil rights, not just of black people, but of all Americans, right? The idea that the Fifth Amendment, out the window. Eighth Amendment, y'all know what that one is, right? Cruel and unusual punishment shall be inflicted, okay? The 14th Amendment, the state cannot deprive you, anyone, of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So how are we getting around that? That's a conversation that I think we really need to have. And I mean, it's a little bit off topic, but it's something I feel like I needed to say here on this one. We've got to, as a nation, begin to have that conversation, and the nation begins here. Now, the more subversive part of it, when you look at Ferguson, and you see that Ferguson was 66% black, and yet they had, what, one black person, two black people on their city council. That's a problem. That is a problem. And I would say that one of the first things that we do is we start to identify communities where that imbalance is clearly happening. And those of you who read the New York Times, you saw that that's clearly the case, not just in Ferguson, right? We see that imbalance both in terms of the city councilors, but also in the representation among law enforcement. we identify those cities, and we do what we can to help support those places in getting more politicians of color that are representative of their communities on the city councils, but also recruit officers. As Chief Jacobs has already said, do what we can to help change that balance. And that's something that all of us can do if we're aware of it and cognizant of it.
So I have a few things. I'm just going to read them because I had notes on that exact question. Community partnership building, and we have to make sure that our leaderships in the police department push that down to the officers. It's not just community building for the managers. We get it, most of us. But we have to push that down to the officers, give them the opportunity to really build community relationships. Transparency, that's important. When something happens, we have to get out there and get in front of it and tell people what happened. If they understand what we did and why we did it, they'll be more trusting of what we did, if it's fair. Accountability, we have to hold people accountable when we find officers that aren't fitting the mold and that aren't doing what we want them to do within our communities. We have to get rid of them. Support training opportunities, both internally and externally. Data collection, we have to look at data to see if it's disproportionate. That's something that we're starting because we didn't do data collection in terms of police stopping people in our neighborhoods. We need to look at that data and see what it reflects. Is it reflecting that we're disproportionately stopping people of color in our neighborhoods? Procedural justice, which I talked about, people feeling that they're respected. Diversity in law enforcement, we've talked about that. We have to get you all to apply for jobs in policing. We need people that really get it, understand, and want to build community relationships. Those are the people that we need in our police departments. Effective reforms within the police department and collaborative effort and engagement all the way around. The last thing I'm going to add that's not on my list is to recognize that we, in our city, we recognize that we have a large undocumented population and we have a lot of immigrants in our community. And I think Chief said it earlier, he said something about citizens, and we got away from using that word because we realized that a lot of the people that live in our neighborhoods aren't citizens. So we call everybody residents, and that way they're more willing to talk to us and give us information and, you know, file police reports because we recognize that they're not here legally, but that has no bearing on how we're going to treat them. They're residents in our city, and we have to treat them like residents, just like we would anybody else.
Very well said.
All right. Well, we're about at our time, and so first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, for coming and being a part of this program, for sharing with us. For sure. Thank you. We've had a lot of people that have supported this and have allowed us to do this through these sessions as we began this. We want to thank the Weisberg Program for Human Rights, the McNair Scholars Program, the Office of Spiritual Life, the Office of Intercultural Affairs, in particular, Daksha Howard. Where are you, Daksha? Stand up. Stand up. I know many of you have read repeatedly her emails, so but thank you so much for all your effort, Daksha, and of course our members of our committee that have been running around with microphones and members up here. Before we dismiss, one thing we want you to understand is this is just the beginning for what we're thinking about doing. We're talking about doing more of this later on in the year, but we still have a lot of things going on for the rest of the year. One thing that's coming up is Dr. Eric Thomas, better known as ET, and he's an exceptional motivating speaker, and he's going to be on our campus on Monday the 20th at 7 o'clock in the atrium. And if anyone's ever heard this man speak before, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you have to come and hear him. We're very fortunate to get him here at a time where I think we really need him. He's talking about motivating campus and community, and the community's been invited, so we'll have another chance to be together to hear E.T. speak. The Sustained Dialogue Summit on Racism at Beloit College is Wednesday, April 22nd, in the morning, so from 9 to 12, so you won't miss the rest of spring day. We had a large number of people coming to that, continuing some of these conversations there, giving us an opportunity to go into a little bit more in depth and to discuss the things that have happened on our campus and reference that as a group and with different people in a room, so we have an opportunity to have some dialogue around that. The Weisberg had a presentation from Marie Gottschalk on April 23rd at 7 o'clock, and that's in Moore Lounge, correct? Marie Gottschalk is a professor of political science at University of Pennsylvania, and her talk is based on her new book, Caught: The Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics. So it's still part of the work that we've been talking about and a part of the series that we've been working on, and so we encourage you all to attend that. We have a culminating event that you're going to hear more information about as we try to bring campus and community together and a show of solidarity over this. We are going to do our version of a die-in on May 2nd on the steps and in front of Middle College. There'll be more details coming. We're going to start about 9:30 in the morning. We hope to have some community and speakers, community involvement, and some people on our campus, and just a social solidarity, talk about the things that are here and hear a message from some people. And so you'll hear more information about that, and so that'll be on May 2nd. That's when it's planned for. Okay. Last but not least, definitely, I want to thank all of you that have been here tonight, all of you that have been here through all the other sessions that we have, and so I think you deserve to give yourselves a round of applause as well. Yeah. Yes, sir.
One last thing before you're done.
Okay. Go ahead.
Just want to say on behalf of the panel, if I can, thank you. And I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. Hold us accountable. Continue these forums. This is going to change America. I want to say one other very important thing here. Don't let another situation happen before you stand up and try to hold us accountable. You're on a roll now. You're on a good roll. You're doing the right thing. Hold us accountable. Help us to police better. Help us to do better. Help change America to be what it's always supposed to be and what it's got to be. So please, and I want to say again, thank you very much for having us here tonight. Don't you agree?
Yes. So many of you have asked us repeatedly, and you may ask us again today. A lot of you have come to us, and as Charlie points out, it's been a great thing. And people are always asking, what can I do? What can I do to be a part of it? What can I do? And I heard a quote from Maya Angelou. Tavis Smiley was talking about his relationship with Maya Angelou and had a quote from her. And her quote to him was, we find our path by continuing to walk it. And it's kind of what Charlie is saying, okay? Stay in the room. All right? Keep coming, keep listening, keep learning, keep trying to understand. Because at some point, as long as you continue to walk, sooner or later, you're going to learn what your path is and what you can do. But in the meantime, stay with it. And that's what we can ask you to do the most. And you've started doing that, and we really appreciate it. So once again, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. And thank you to you as well. So.